I could already see the headline. Former Marine attempts hike across America, only to be air rescued off a Southern California mountain for stupidity. Less than 2 weeks into the trip. More tonight at 10 p.m. I know, really wordy. Who writes these headlines? This is the Long Journey Podcast with Jason Jamar, detailing my travels across America as I share thrilling stories from my 16-month backpacking adventure from California to Maine and my 8-month kayak voyage from Maine to Texas. Day 4. Date, September 23, 1999. Elevation, 1,430 feet. Sunrise, 6:37 a.m. Sunset, 6:42 p.m. Moon phase, full moon. Location, Ramona, California. A scene at the end of Dances with Wolves gets me every time. Dances with Wolves rides away from the camp with his wife, stands with a fist. Up on a distant mountain ledge, wind in his hair, shouts to his friend, Sukman Tutonka Owachi. Or in English, Dances with Wolves. Dances with Wolves. I am wind in his hair. Do you see that I am your friend? Can you see that you will always be my friend? Even now, just mentioning the movie, the soundtrack crescendos in my head. I am deeply moved. It is a very powerful scene. You feel the twinge in your heart as the once antagonistic wind in his hair has grown to love his friend and aches to say goodbye. This scene is so moving because deep down, we all desire a connection and friendship this close, but too often eludes us because of our own emotional baggage and our unique ability to confound what we think others think about us versus reality. However, when you forge a strong and meaningful friendship, saying goodbye is that much harder, especially when that friend has gone before us and crossed over the veil. Most friendships start out very amicably, but not all. Only a very few will turn into a BFF yelling from the mountaintops. Some friendships are born out of contention, just as Wind in His Hair and Dances with Wolves began as adversaries. Some friendships start in a manner that rubs you the wrong way. But for whatever reason, you have to deal with them. You are forced to coexist. After a while, you find that even though their company is irritating and painful, it makes you a stronger person. Or if anything, they callous you and make you tougher in places where you were too soft. Blisters are these types of friends. By this point, all my blisters and my blisters had begun to callous and toughen up my feet, so that the nightly ritual of gingerly tiptoeing around the camp, dancing if you will, around the fire, began to pass. That morning, I continued my upward trek along Highway 67 towards the Southern California mountains. At lunch, I found a little Mexican restaurant with a buffet. It was awesome. There are regional variations to Mexican food here in the States and south of the border. This was Cali Mex, which is very different from the Tex-Mex that I had grown up with, but very agreeable with the old taste buds. However, not so agreeable that afternoon, as I kept trekking up the hills. Not agreeable at all. Chuck it up to another thing that you learn along the way. All-you-can-eat enchiladas and strenuous hiking are a terrible combination and lead to another kind of dancing. Just on the outskirts of Ramona, I happened upon a fruit and vegetable stand late in the day. I was hungry again and thought that fresh fruit would ease my system. So I stopped in and purchased some items. A lovely older woman named Marguerite owned the stand. She was delightful to visit with. While I was there, another gentleman driving a Jeep Wagoneer pulled in to get some fruit. Fred Sproul was his name. Fred looked as though he had just come off a safari, with khaki shorts and a safari shirt and a pith hat. My only reference for the pith hat was Van Pelt from Jumanji, or that Marine Corps primary marksman instructors wore them. I would find out later that his dad had been a Marine rifle instructor. Fred was a wildlife biologist and botanist. Fred was the first of many whose power of observation and generosity would be such an encouragement in my travels. We all visited for a few moments, and once Fred learned what I was doing, he invited me to camp at his place that night. Fred had his own little valley a couple of miles back in the hills, and an excellent place for me to camp. His dog kept me company at my campsite. Did I say dog? I meant miniature horse and Anatolian shepherd. Fred made dinner for us, and we spent the evening visiting. Fred had many fascinating stories and had multiple books published in his field of study. The following morning, the valley was buzzed by a couple of jets from MCAS Miramar, a reminder of the world I was leaving behind. After breakfast, Fred took me back up to the highway where he found me, and we said goodbye. I thanked him and then made my way into Ramona, 3.5 miles away. I made a point to stop at the local Subway in town because, well, I had plenty of free sandwiches. I carried 300 feet worth of Sub Club cards, all stamped and ready to use. I stopped at a laundromat to wash some clothes and found a great trail mix at a local store. I also purchased some Dr. Scholl's insoles. At night when I camped, my feet and ankles hurt so bad I could barely walk on them. I found that I was just flat-footed enough not to keep me out of the Marine Corps, but that carrying 100 pounds of weight daily was more than I could handle. Some afternoons I would have to switch from my hiking shoes to my 16-inch all-leather boots because they offered much better arch support. This looked rather comical wearing shorts and knee-high leather boots. The insole inserts for my hiking shoes proved to be a very worthwhile purchase. After lunch, finished with my errands, I started up Highway 78 towards Santa Isabel. About 6 miles out of town, I came across a fantastic RV park, the Western Horizon Ramona Canyon RV Resort. Say that 10 times really fast. The place was excellent. I hadn't planned to stop so early in the day, but having a place to camp with these amenities seemed awfully hard to pass up. So I went in and inquired about tent camping. I set up my camp and wandered over to the clubhouse, where I found a big screen television not being used. So I flipped it on, and what should I see on cable but one of my favorite movies, Dances with Wolves. And it had just begun. I'll be honest, a part of this movie spoke to the romanticized idea in my head of what this trip could be, and the lines spoken by Kevin Costner resonated with me. I had never known who John Dunbar was, perhaps because the name itself had no meaning, but as I heard my Sioux name being called over and over, I knew for the first time who I really was. Just like John Dunbar, the journey we find ourselves on calls into question who we are and who we will be by the journey's end. When I had planned this trip, I thought I would have company. After the night camping with Fred's horse dog, I realized a good dog is what I need on this trek. But maybe after the last desert was behind me. Soon after leaving the Western Horizon Ramona Canyon RV Park, I hiked up to Santa Isabel, camped for the night, and then onward to Warner Springs, California, an elevation of 4,065 feet above sea level. It had been several hot days, well above average for this time of year. It was 104 degrees when I arrived at the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, Station 52. A fire truck had passed me a mile or two before, and the firefighters waved as I passed by. They were outside the station waiting to greet me when I got to town. They invited me to stay the afternoon, so I got a fire station tour, including gear and trucks. Then we went inside and had a terrific lunch, and settled in for a movie and a nice place to relax through the afternoon's heat. That evening, I ventured onto the Pacific Crest Trail, or the PCT. It ran right past the fire station. The Pacific Crest Trail is a 2,653-mile continuous trail that runs from the U.S.-Mexico border near Campo, California, to the U.S.-Canada border near Manning Park in Washington State. The plan was to hike this for a few miles north, toward Palm Springs. I jumped on the trail not long before dusk and hiked about a mile or so before finding a place to eat supper and rest until the moon was up high. I hit the trail hard with the light of the moon. I knocked off around 2:30 a.m. for two reasons. I was dog-tired, and I was terrified. I had found mountain lion tracks, and the lion was stalking a deer from their pattern. I never saw the lion, but the tracks were very large, and since it was the middle of the night, I decided to hang it up until daylight. Hiking this section of the PCT at night, besides the trail below me, you could see no evidence man had ever been there. No one for miles, no city lights, no house lights, nothing but wilderness. This reminded me of the book Undaunted Courage by Stephen E. Ambrose. He took excerpts from the journals of Meriwether Lewis and letters written by Lewis, William Clark, Thomas Jefferson, and the members of the Corps of Discovery from their famed expedition. The abundance of wildlife and vast expanses of untamed land in their journal entries had always tickled my imagination, and I thought that this part of the trail was like what they encountered in their travels. Against my better judgment, I slept in the next day and missed the cool of the morning. The heat was brutal that day, triple digits again. Thankfully, I found a spring on the trail not too far into the day, so I filtered and refilled my water. I carried a pure water filtration pump designed for backpacking, a very nifty device. I was relieved to have found the spring on the trail, because I didn't have any trail maps. This was a boneheaded move on my part. Really boneheaded. Traveling the PCT was a last-moment addition to the trip. Early in July, I had scouted out sections of the trail around Warner Springs, and there had been plenty of water in the small creeks and streams in the area. However, getting section maps of the PCT online proved somewhat tricky, and I was not willing to buy the whole map book to see only about 50 or 70 miles of the route. It was 1999. Now it's not a problem downloading the map. At the end of July, my commanding officer asked if I would go to South Korea for a month. I had never been to Korea, so what better way to spend my last month in the Marine Corps? I accepted. By the time I returned, I had only a week to go through my separation process from the Corps. Then I returned home, dropping off supplies along predetermined points in 25 cities between San Diego, California, and Marble Falls, Texas. I had buried water in critical locations across the southwestern United States in preparation for my walk. Except here. There had been a drought in the 3 months since my scouting trip, and I had been gone for at least 2 of those months. I didn't know how bad it had been, so when I got to the trail, the small creeks I had used as a gauge for water supply were now dry or dwindling. I was a little anxious, but I pressed on. I had 2 100-ounce Camelback pouches and 6 20-ounce water bottles and some Gatorade that the firefighters gave me, or about 2.75 gallons. Under normal circumstances, this should have gotten me a couple of days down the trail. However, I was not yet acclimated to this level of strenuous exertion and was using a lot of fluids. It should be noted, despite having reduced the weight of my pack in Poway, California, I was still carrying 89 pounds on my back without a full complement of food and water, just my gear alone. I was going through much more water than I had planned. I wasn't making great strides each day either. There were a lot of switchbacks and elevation changes, and very strenuous hiking. With the amount of weight on my back, with added heat, I tried to take a break during the hottest part of the day. This little spring was a very scenic spot, and I just wanted to stay. but I knew I should keep pressing on until I made camp that night. There was no sense in staying too long on the trail without maps and knowing where exactly I was and where resources could be found. The next day, I got an earlier start, but it took only a short time for the temperature to rise. I tried to stay upbeat and confident. Despite having refilled my water the day before, I was running low, and now I was a fool to travel this section without a map. If I only knew how much farther I would have to hike until there was more water, I would feel less anxious. All I knew was this section was approximately 50 miles, and it was slow going. By mid-morning, I was getting down to my last water bottle. I began to ration what I had, and regardless of how often I tried to focus on anything else, my mind kept returning to the water issue. I started praying. Around midday, I happened upon a small hole in a rock that had water in it. I was excited, and I thanked God for his provision. I siphoned it out with my water filter and filled up a couple of water bottles. And then I thought, I should taste it before filling up any more. I took one large gulp and immediately spat it out. It was horrible and extremely bitter. I was afraid to drink any more of it. So with feelings of betrayal, anger, and angst, I poured out the water and trudged down the trail. I now found I could only think about my waning water supplies. Finally, at 1:30 p.m., I crested a prominent peak and was able to see off to the northwest. I spotted a small building in the distance, slightly less than a mile away, and it looked like a small outbuilding. Still, I was excited. A building means people, and people means water. I was hoping that there would be a spigot outside where I could refill my bottles. So with a renewed sense of vigor, I picked up my pace. However, I soon realized that the trail was going in the wrong direction, instead leading away from it and not closer. This was unacceptable. I thought, what if I stage my pack here, take my camelback and my water bottles, and walk across country, get some water, and then come back to the trail? The trail was not precisely at the crest of the hill, but near it, and it was about 600 feet down to the valley below, in the direction of the building. It was really steep, but it looked like I could maneuver down the side of the hill. Looks can be deceiving. I started down. Did I mention that it was steep? It was incredibly steep. I found myself climbing down trees. Then the undergrowth was impassable. I had brought my hatchet with me just for this reason. However, after about an hour of climbing, stopping to clear a path, climbing more, and stopping again to hatchet a course, I had to stop. I was drenched in sweat, overheated, and worn out. I was working harder than I had been carrying my pack on the trail. I knew the old saying about conserving your sweat, not your water, but I wasn't doing a very good job at either. At this point, discouragement struck. I sat there for a while, weighing my options. I didn't know exactly where I was on the PCT. I didn't know how far it was to water on the trail or how soon it would be before I could get to the building, or if the building even had water. There was water over a day behind me, but where would that get me once I was there? I didn't have a phone. I did have a flare gun, and I still had a quarter bottle of water left. I wasn't in trouble yet. However, I was concerned that it could be much worse if I didn't get more water soon. I imagined that I would be a joke, a laughingstock. I could already see the headline story. Former Marine attempts hike across America, only to be air rescued off a Southern California mountain for stupidity. Less than 2 weeks into the trip. More tonight at 10 p.m. I could hear my story as a late-night talk show punchline. I could hear Jay Leno in my head. The idea of failure was what bothered me the most. Pride and ego go hand in hand. You don't want them holding your hand out here. I prayed, asked for guidance, and stepped out on faith that all would be okay. Before I had started the trip, I was reminded of a verse a friend had challenged me with. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 through 7. After a moment, I felt that the best thing I could do was to eat a light lunch, drink the remaining water, and then rest until the heat of the day abated. Then walk down the trail and God would provide the water. I know it sounds crazy, but I had complete peace about it. So I climbed back up the trail, got my lunch, and polished off my remaining water. And then I took a nap. At about 5 p.m., I decided it was time to start again. The trail continued away from the little building. It wasn't long before I noticed a road running through the valley. After a few more turns in the path, I eventually reached the Caliche Dirt Road. I stopped at the road. Straight ahead, I saw a trail marker for the PCT. To the west, nothing but the dirt road and the desert mountains. To the east, nothing, but then in the distance, I saw a dust cloud rapidly approaching. A white pickup emerged from the cloud as it rounded the corner. It wasn't hard to flag the gentleman down. He stopped, and I introduced myself and asked if he had any water. He didn't, but he said there was a general store in Agwanga, 20 miles away, that he would be happy to take me to. His passenger seat was full of blueprints that he had to shift around so that I could fit. He had left a construction site 15 miles to the other side of the mountain, a Boy Scout facility that they were building. I was thrilled to accept the ride. This would end my time hiking on the PCT. I would take the original route that I had planned. I spent some time looking at Google Maps this week in preparation for this episode, and I found that the little building was the San Diego State University Sky Oaks Field Station. And where the PCT crossed the road, the Lost Valley Road, is now the trailhead for the Combs Mountain Trail. And now there's a little spot called Mike's Place where you can camp, not too far away. Neither this nor the Trail Angel Water Station, right there where I met the engineer, were around back then like they are today. We arrived at Agwanga. The locals would tell me that Agwanga meant water. If you look it up online, some will say it is a mistranslation of Native American to Spanish to English, meaning land of the dog people or land of running water. There wasn't much to Agwanga, only an RV park, a post office, and a little general store. My ride let me off, and I thanked him profusely and stepped inside. I should describe how I was dressed. I wore a fedora, a khaki shirt, a bandana, khaki pants, and 16-inch all-leather boots. I was sweat-drenched and caked in dust, and I am sure I looked like I just stepped out of the 19th century, and had probably gotten separated from the company headed for San Juan. The fellow who owned the store took one look at me as I walked in and said, "Well, that's a get-up." I laughed and introduced myself. His name was David Coons, and I had 5 minutes until the place closed. I got a couple of water bottles and splurged on a Dr. Pepper. Once David learned more about what I was doing, he invited me home to meet his family. David had been a mechanic in the Marine Corps years before. His wife, Abby, cooked us a steak dinner, and we had a delightful time visiting. Abby was a school teacher, so we couldn't stay up too late, which was fine by me because I was bushed and ready for sleep. A terrific turn of events. Not only could I drink as much water as possible, but I also did my laundry and got a much-needed shower. Had I not arrived at that dirt road intersecting the PCT precisely when I did, I would not have caught the ride off the trail. I was so glad I hadn't become a late-night talk show joke. I was thankful and blown away by the provision of water that I now had, when just a couple hours before, it looked pretty bleak. Agwanga had most certainly come to mean water. Next time on the Long Journey Podcast, long lost trails, parachute cord, and barbaric yelps. You can find more details about the Long Journey podcast at journeylong.com. And be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your platform of choice. Thank you, and may you journey long.